In the winter of 1943, the eastern part of Ukraine appeared on the map as a shifting shade of grey. Vast stretches of land had been fought over again and again by both sides within a single year, and the front line advanced and retreated like a tide, blurring the outlines of towns in smoke and shellfire. Roads had grown rigid under the deep winter frost and snow, layers of ice covering the ruts left by tank tracks, like ripples frozen in place. Along the line of the Donets River, Soviet forces were pushing forward, trying, in their preparatory actions before the Battle of Kursk, to stabilize the southern sector of the front. The German withdrawal routes were chaotic and hasty. After failed defensive actions around Kharkov, some units no longer existed as coherent formations and could only rely on their remaining vehicles, infantry, and exhausted communications personnel to try to regroup further west. The villages at the fringe of the front were bombed and set ablaze, then frozen again in the cold wave, becoming mute ruins made of twisted beams, collapsed brick walls, and roof tiles buried under snow. Across this war-ravaged belt of land, the Soviet rear organized a large number of temporary prisoner-of-war camps. They had no fixed form. Some were converted from schools, others from abandoned farmsteads or crude wooden sheds. The units responsible for administration were usually detached from rear area or guard regiments. Their regulations were not especially systematic, but constant tension kept them in a state of high alert. The edges of the camps were made of barbed wire and wooden posts. Beyond lay low, open fields, and at the far end of those fields stood leafless birch trees, their trunks like countless upright grey-white lines, almost merging with the colour of the sky. It was in such a winter that Karl Hartmann was marched into one of these camps. He had been assigned to a communications unit in the Wehrmacht, a branch not meant for direct assaults, but during the German withdrawal in the direction of Kharkov, he was cut off in a rearguard collapse and fell into Soviet hands. Throughout the long stretches of the march, he walked beside rails frozen stiff, his worn-out army boots barely keeping out the cold that seeped up through the mixture of old ice and mud underfoot. Once, he had played the piano in an evening classroom next to the conservatory in Cologne. Later, in the army, he never again had the chance to touch a keyboard. His hands were split from the cold, the skin at his fingertips rough and uneven, as if scraped by some hard object. The camp occupied a village school damaged by shellfire. Half of the outer wall had been blasted down. Window frames clung to the remaining corners, and shards of glass were embedded in the frozen mud. The corridors of the school building had been reduced to two facing brick walls, with the overhead beams blackened by fire, bearing scorch marks. Inside, the light was dim, with only a few oil lamps, known as camp lamps, casting a weak glow. The air smelled of mildew, mixed with the scent of charred wood, damp earth, and the particular chill of winter. Upon arrival, Karl was assigned to a room near an old classroom where he crowded onto a bed of rough planks with other prisoners. The beds were nailed to the floor with gaps between the boards. At night, the wind slipped through those cracks, leaving the air only slightly warmer than outdoors, yet still piercingly cold. Life in the camp was made up of roll calls, distributions, simple labor, and more roll calls, regular yet utterly unchanging. The prisoners spoke little. Most of the time, they simply remained silent in their exhaustion and in the cold. They had to move quickly during work. Any delay would bring sharp shouts from the guards. The faces of the Soviet guards often bore a mix of caution and fatigue. In the long winter hours of sentry duty, they too were worn down by the cold. Outside the camp, the road lay under snow, the tracks of marching columns pressed deep and stretching into the distance. From time to time, a supply vehicle would pass, leaving behind a faint trail of diesel fumes in the frigid air. Karl's days were no different from those of the other prisoners. He passed each one in obedience to orders. Until one cleaning detail, when he was assigned along with a few other prisoners to clear out a sealed old classroom. The room was at the far end of the school building, its door scarred by a long burn mark, as though it had once been blackened by fire. When the door was pushed open, the air that escaped carried the heavy, stale odor of long confinement mixed with dust and the faint scent of decaying wood. The window frame was bare, the glass gone. Cold wind poured through the gap, sending the dust inside swirling in the light. It was amid this dust that Karl saw the broken piano. It leaned against the inner wall of the classroom, its casing split, the front panel blasted open at one corner by shell shock, exposing the metal strings and wooden frame within. The keyboard was visibly damaged. Some keys snapped, others scorched yellow by intense heat. The legs were unstable, as if the slightest touch might topple the instrument. Yet it was still a piano. Its shape and size matched the one in his memory, and even in its ruin, it had not become indistinguishable from scrap iron. In the dim winter light, the piano bore a silence left behind by both time and shellfire. As Carl looked at it, a difficult-to-name sense of familiarity rose in his chest. He did not deliberately approach it. He only caught occasional glimpses of the white fragments of keys and the grain of the wooden shell as he swept the floor. These details were enough to remind him of many moments from his pre-war life. The light in the evening classroom, the patterns of practice, the vibrations of notes along the strings. The moment was brief, but Carl did not yet realize that this shattered piano would change his perception of time inside the camp. Nor could he have expected that this damaged instrument would, in the weeks to come, become the faintest yet most genuine bridge between two opposing sides. In the days that followed, Carl was assigned to cleaning and carrying tasks around the school building. Like the other prisoners, he hauled blasted bricks, planks, and twisted iron scraps through the cold wind to the dumping ground outside the camp. The work itself was not the most brutal, but the bite of winter made every bend of his back, every turn of his body, feel as though it were draining the last reserves of warmth from him. From time to time, the camp kitchen would manage to boil a thin soup. Steam rose from the iron pot, only to vanish quickly in the cold air, leaving behind a faint smell as the only comfort. The prisoners lined up around the pot, and the thin hot broth dripping from the wooden ladles was often regarded at night as a kind of survivor's privilege. Carl's mental state gradually dulled in these monotonous days. He grew accustomed to hearing roll calls among the remaining piles of snow on the yard, accustomed to the short, clipped commands when Soviet guards changed shifts, and accustomed to the rustling of prisoners turning over in their bunks at night as they tried to escape the cold. His thoughts mostly swung between exhaustion and hunger, sometimes drifting back over everything that had brought him from Cologne to this place, from conscription to communications training to the chaos of the frontline retreat. He could no longer clearly recall the sensation of piano keys beneath his fingertips. He remembered only that the densely printed notes on a score had once created a stable order, an order that had been completely shattered by the war, until one day he was sent back to clean the old classroom. The wind was sharper than usual that day, whistling faintly as it cut across the broken brick edges of the window opening. There was not much dust accumulated inside the classroom, but moisture seeping from beneath the ice in the corners of the walls had frozen into a thin layer of frost, making the floor gleam. When Carl looked up, his gaze again rested on the broken piano. It still leaned quietly against the wall, the lid half open, the metal frame inside catching the weak light with a cold, hard gleam. The cracks in the wooden casing seemed deeper than before, as though they had been further pulled apart by the cold. He did not deliberately step closer. As he swept near it, his broom or foot brushed one of the piano's legs by chance. The body of the instrument tilted slightly and gave off a few short, metallic vibrations. It did not quite sound like musical notes, more like the collision of objects and the ghost of resonance, yet it was enough to break the oppression in the air. Carl froze for a moment, then resumed sweeping, thinking no more of it. Even so, this brief contact made him realize that, despite the extent of its damage, the piano still had the capacity to produce sound. That awareness echoed in his mind over the next several days. Not long after, the atmosphere in the camp shifted in a subtle way. One afternoon, a truck carrying several Soviet officers and civilian personnel drove along the edge of the compound. Draped on it was a length of red cloth commonly used by Soviet cultural propaganda units. Such units were not unusual on the Eastern Front in 1943. They typically stayed at front-line medical stations or rear area camps, providing short performances, recitations, and choral pieces for soldiers in order to bolster morale. Many of these groups were composed of young people trained at conservatories. They had been assigned by the political directorate to the armed forces to perform a kind of non-combat, yet essential duty. This particular unit seemed to have stopped here only because nearby roads had been damaged. They were given space in a half-collapsed warehouse beside the school building to tune their instruments. A few Soviet guards stood watch nearby, but the mood was relatively relaxed. The prisoners were kept at a distance as ordered, yet Carl could still hear certain sounds from inside the warehouse. Perhaps a viola testing its strings, perhaps a wooden instrument being tuned. In the cold air, these sounds were unnaturally clear, as if coming from a completely different world. To many prisoners, such sounds were strange and remote, but to Carl, they were like a signal suddenly resurfacing from deep within his memory, awakening a sense long numbed. By evening, the weather had turned even colder. Wind swept in from the open ground outside the camp, hardening the surface of the snow into a brittle crust that cracked audibly underfoot. Members of the propaganda unit continued a brief rehearsal inside the warehouse, snatches of melody drifting out from time to time, only to be swallowed by the cold. After the evening roll call, Carl was on his way back to the barracks when he once more heard a faint sound from the direction of the classroom. He was not entirely sure what it was, but the metallic vibration was exactly the same as the sound the piano had made when he had brushed against it. As Carl entered the barracks, he noticed that several other prisoners were listening to the same sound, though no one spoke. Like him, they were drawn to this strange yet familiar noise, unsure whether they should react at all. The lamplight in the barracks was dim. The wooden beams, contracted by the night cold, creaked faintly from time to time. The trembling of strings from outside mingled with the sounds in the beams, as if unintentionally answering each other. Carl could not explain what he felt. He had believed that war and exhaustion had dulled his sensitivity to music, yet the broken piano and the distant tuning had, without his noticing, awakened a sense of order deep within him. That sense of order had almost vanished in the fire of war, and now it reappeared like a faint glimmer seeping through the cracks of the ruins. He did not know that this glimmer would lead the story toward an unexpected ensemble. That evening, the air above the camp was as cold as a thin sheet of ice freshly cut from a frozen river, pressing down on all sound. The propaganda unit had gathered again in the old classroom, their breath condensed into a pale mist above the light inside. The wooden floorboards, frozen stiff, answered every step with a dry, cracking echo. The viola rested against an arm, the accordion lay strapped to a chest, but no one was in a hurry to play, as if they were all waiting for some signal that had yet to appear. Carl was sweeping a corridor not far from the classroom. Twilight filtered in through the window openings, giving the damaged brickwork a faint, bluish hue. He sensed instinctively that something about the atmosphere was different from other days. The camp seemed to have fallen under an invisible pressure of quiet. Even the distant guard tower ceased its restless pacing. The broken piano stood in the depths of the classroom. It sat there like a forgotten witness. The cracked lid, the split wooden shell, the missing keys, all frozen in a fragile stillness. No one went near it, and no one believed it held any meaning. Yet in those few seconds of silence, the air felt as though it had been torn open by a sudden, almost imperceptible tremor. The first sound came from the piano. It was not a deliberate test note, but more like a key brushed lightly in the cold, releasing a frail yet distinct tone. The sound lasted only a moment, but it provoked a stifled echo around the ruined room. Carl lifted his head, the broom arrested halfway through its motion. The sound was too familiar. So familiar it felt like a piece of an old dream rising up to overtake him. Then came a second note, and a third. Their pitch was unstable, some warped by the cold, others constrained by the damaged frame, yet together they carved an undeniable direction into the air. It was not probing, not hesitant, but like a long-suppressed will forcing its way out through a broken structure. The viola answered at that moment. The bowhair touched the string and drew out a deep, full note that seemed to carry body heat within it. This sound did not wait for the piano's rhythm. It entered directly, colliding with it in the very first second and sending a shiver through the air. The broken piano seemed suddenly activated, responding with a rough but recognizable chord. The viola's melody adjusted itself, its tone shifting from cautious to resolute, leaping along the walls and covering over the fractures in the piano's sound. Carl could barely breathe. This was not an ensemble slowly taking shape, but a burst of growth out of the ruins, sudden and irrepressible. It was like water under ice breaking through a membrane, like a snow-buried cabin suddenly lit from within by candlelight. Every note vibrated in the cold air, every vibration striking against the camp's silence. The instrument's damage gave the piano's sound a texture of mingled metal and splintered wood, but it was precisely this imperfection that made the warmth of the viola stand out so starkly. The two sounds intertwined in the classroom, forming a structure that seemed almost impossible. One came from a shattered instrument, the other from a front-line musician. One rose out of captive memories, the other out of the fatigue of campaign and march. In that moment, there was no interval between them, no testing of ground. They collided and fused at once, becoming an ensemble that felt less like performance than like instinct. It was the gentlest of the recurring themes from Tchaikovsky's The Seasons, fragmented yet unmistakable. The piano traced out a broken harmonic frame, while the viola followed close behind, its steady line filling in the missing pieces. The melody was not smooth, but at every leap it made one aware that the two voices were searching for each other, leaning toward each other. In the corridor, the prisoners stopped what they were doing. At the door, the guards ceased their patrol and simply stood still. In the warehouse, people fell silent and turned toward the direction of the classroom. The air tightened like a string, stretched across the whole camp. Karl stood in the half-dark of the corridor, his fingers trembling slightly in the cold. He did not move closer, did not cross any boundary, but remained where he was, struck to the core by the melody. He felt something deep in his chest, long pressed down, suddenly torn open, as if this ensemble were not happening in the classroom at all, but inside his own body. The passage of music lasted less than 30 seconds, yet it felt as though it had stilled the entire world for 30 years. When the 30 seconds of ensemble were over, the classroom fell silent again. But it was not the same silence as before. It carried the delayed aftershock of the music, so that even after the sound had died, it continued to reverberate faintly along the walls. The piano strings, having shuddered, sank into a kind of fragile stillness, and the tone of the viola ebbed slowly out of the air. Under the darkening sky, the light inside the room grew more indistinct, while the frost on the beams reflected a faint glimmer, like embers that had only just been allowed to burn. No one spoke, and no one moved to leave. The performers from the propaganda unit held their positions, their arms still poised above strings and keys, as though afraid that any motion would cause the echo of the melody to vanish. The Soviet guards at the corridor entrance remained quiet as well, their eyes resting on the space above the broken piano, no longer marked by their usual vigilance, but by a calm that defied easy explanation. After a few seconds, the wind in the camp made itself heard again, carrying flecks of snow against the brick edges of the window openings, making the space that had just been filled with music seem even more empty. After this stretch of silence, the violist of the propaganda unit lifted his bow once more. He did not repeat the melody that had just been played, but instead let a simple, cautious scale probe the room. The sound was gentle and slow, as if testing whether the ensemble had truly taken place. The broken piano did not reply at once. After a few seconds of quiet, however, a note emerged from the keys, so soft it was nearly drowned by the wind, yet still sharp enough to draw taut the senses of everyone present. From that day forward, an almost imperceptible yet real change began to take shape in the camp's atmosphere. It was not brought about by any change in regulations, nor by any sudden kindness from the guards. It was the music, unintentional, fragile, and irregular, that created a kind of order which did not come from command. The propaganda unit continued its circuit according to schedule, but whenever it happened to stay near the camp, its members would slip into the old classroom for brief sessions of playing. The interplay between the viola, the accordion, and the broken piano was not a formal rehearsal. It was more like a way of defending themselves, in spirit, against the winter. The ensemble was unstable and never lasted long, but each time it appeared, it caused the air, long since solidified in the camp, to ripple in quiet, nearly invisible ways. The prisoners began to slow their pace slightly on the paths they walked after work, drawing closer to the corridor near the classroom, not to eavesdrop, but simply to check whether the sound was still there. The Soviet guards did not immediately stop this behavior. After a few early trials, they chose instead to watch. They understood these small acts posed no real threat, and the calm the music brought into an environment of exhaustion and cold seemed to benefit them as well. Sometimes the sound of the broken piano could be heard even outside the classroom. It was a trembling tone that drifted with the wind, spreading outward like a buried memory surfacing in the air. Whenever Karl heard the piano's resonance, he paused briefly in his work. He did not join in, nor did he speak to anyone about the music. He simply allowed each note, when it reached him, to pass through the part of himself that war had not yet completely eroded. Most striking of all, the order of the camp did not fray because of these ensembles. At certain moments, it even grew more quiet. The prisoners never tried to use the music as cover for escape or disruption, and the guards never treated the music as a threat. It was as if both sides, by some unspoken agreement, laid down their guard for a few minutes, even if only within the confines of the classroom. These fragments of ensemble often lasted less than a few minutes, the melody frequently broken off by the piano's defects. Even so, the presence of music in the camp became impossible to ignore. It was like a voiceless force seeping through the frozen air, so that time in the camp was no longer dictated solely by roll calls and labor. At certain hours it opened brief intervals that did not obey the logic of war. Carl began to notice that his own behavior shifted quietly after he listened to the music. His movements during work grew slower yet steadier, and although he still spoke little to the other prisoners around him, there was a clearer rhythm to his interactions than before. His perception of the cold also altered slightly. It still cut to the bone, but no longer pushed him into complete numbness. Music did not change the structure of the camp, nor did it change the identities of the two sides. But it changed the density of the air itself, the rhythm of every breath they took, allowing them, for brief spans of time, to feel they were surrounded by the same sound. As time went on, these ensembles ceased to be seen as accidents and became a distinctive feature of life in the camp. There were no records of them, no orders, and no explanations. They simply kept happening, like a natural phenomenon that came and went with the winter snow, and in that winter, every such ensemble was a small yet genuine ceasefire. As winter neared its end, the layers of snow around the camp began to loosen. Daylight grew a little longer. In the afternoons, faint thaw lines appeared on the snow, only to refreeze into a harder crust at night. The trees' branches were still thin and bare, but under the wind, one could occasionally hear the faint rasp of their friction. The ruins of buildings that had lain under snow for so long gradually revealed more details as the cycle of melting and freezing continued. Burned beams, shattered bricks, roof tiles torn loose by artillery, all showing in the sunlight as layered shades of grey and white, making the outlines of the camp stand out more sharply. One morning, the vehicles of the propaganda unit appeared on the road outside the camp. Their stay had never been fixed, and as the front began to shift once more, they were ordered back toward units closer to the lines. Their departure was marked by no ceremony. They simply loaded their instruments and sparse belongings, then left the compound under guard. The sound of engines lingered for only a few seconds in the cold air before fading away, leaving behind the wheel tracks pressed into the snow, stretching out along the road. The broken piano remained in the old classroom. It was neither taken away nor repaired. It simply continued to lean against the cracked wall. Because of the constant damp, its lid had warped further, lifting slightly in more places, and fine fissures in the keys, frozen by the cold, gleamed faintly whenever the light struck them. On the keys that had most often been touched, there were shallow traces of wear, as if quietly recording the events of the past few weeks. With the propaganda unit gone, the camp reverted to its previous order. Labor, roll call, distribution, and guard duty once again took precedence. Occasionally, someone would pass by the old classroom, but their steps no longer slowed because of music. The broken piano did not sound again. Even when the wind came through the open window frame and brushed against the strings, the low temperature rendered them almost incapable of vibration. It existed there, but the world no longer answered it. In the weeks that followed, Carl continued to carry out the tasks assigned to him. His body had grown noticeably thinner, his hands cracked from constant contact with cold surfaces, yet his movements were steadier than before. As he walked through different parts of the camp, he would sometimes glance toward the old classroom, but he did not go in. The smell and light inside that room remained clear in his memory, but he understood that the moments belonging to the music had passed. The classroom was now merely a place for storing worn-out objects, and the piano was once again just another forgotten item. After one morning roll call, Carl was placed in a group of prisoners scheduled for transfer to a camp deeper inside the country. As he left and passed the school building, the brick corners of the empty window openings shone a pale blue in the morning light, sharpened by reflections from the ice. He did not stop walking, but as he went past the old classroom, he seemed to catch a faint vibration from within. It might have been nothing more than the wind moving through the beams or the strings responding to a small shift in temperature. He could not be certain, but in that instant a small, persistent warmth rose in his chest. The transfer column moved through the gates and onto a road buried in snow, heading farther away while the camp shrank behind them. At a distance, the schoolhouse became no more than a grey shape. When Carl looked back, he saw only an ordinary prisoner of war camp, no smoke, no flags, and nothing to suggest that an ensemble had ever taken place there. Yet the music remained inside him, not as a complete melody, but as a sensitivity unexpectedly awakened in an extreme environment. It made him understand that there were moments within the structure of war that did not follow orders, did not obey ideology, and did not distinguish between opposing sides. They arose instead from a capacity for feeling that all human beings share. The tone of the broken piano had been impure, the strings unstable, the frame damaged. But in those 30 seconds it had surpassed its physical limits, allowing two opposing forces to share the same sound amid the ruins. Many years later, after the war, multiple oral testimonies by Soviet and German musicians would indicate that in the rear areas of the Ukrainian and Belarusian sectors between 1943 and 1944, similar incidents did occur. They left no trace in official documents and were never systematically catalogued in military archives, yet they lived on with striking clarity in the memories of those who took part. Such events often unfolded in temporary camps, ruined buildings, or makeshift warehouses. The instruments were mostly damaged and incomplete, the performers drawn from opposing armies, yet in a particular moment, because of music, they paused in their enmity. Those brief intervals did not alter the course of the war, but they allowed many people for a short time amid extreme hardship to realize that they shared with their enemies the same cultural roots. When Carl looked back on that experience in his later years, he never described it as a miracle, nor did he exaggerate it into a symbol. He simply remembered that on a winter night so cold that all sound seemed sluggish, he heard music rising from the depths of a ruin, and that this music made him, even as a prisoner of war, suddenly feel that he was still a person capable of understanding the world and being moved by it. The broken piano itself would eventually vanish along with the dismantling of the camp, but in that winter it had generated a kind of power. That power allowed people, in the least likely of circumstances, to recognize that music belongs to humanity, not to any single side. It is not constrained by borders, nor governed by ideology. It travels from strings into the air, and from the air into the chest, reminding those involved in the war that they once had a shared culture, a shared memory, a shared capacity for feeling. Amid the ruins of war, this reminder was faint, yet enough to make people pause. The sound of that ensemble ultimately dissolved into the wind, but the meaning it carried continued in the hearts of all who had heard it. The echo of the broken piano became a kind of emblem of music's ability to pierce hostility in the harshest conditions, of the deep commonality in culture that runs far beyond political division, and of the possibility that even in war, the human spirit can still be lit. And on that stretch of Ukrainian land covered by winter snow, the voice of the broken piano became, in the end, the briefest yet truest ceasefire of an era.